Welcome, everybody. This is the Rotary E-Club of Silicon Valley, and every week we bring you the stories of people who are improving the world around them, making the lives of others better locally, globally, and digitally. Our club, the Rotary E-Club of Silicon Valley, is online, as one would guess, but it's also asynchronous. It's a club designed to give those people who have a heart for service, but crazy busy schedules, that opportunity to be part of a global group finding innovative ways to make things better. It is a good way to live your life and a good way to hang out with some people who are really quite fun. So, one of the stories that we have picked up this year is one about human trafficking. And as a part of my work as an educator, Sharan and her organization have been doing quite a bit to help a student of mine working on a project. And I thought, oh my goodness, this is such interesting stuff. Our club and its audience needs to hear this. So I welcome Sharan, you and the South Bay Coalition in Human Trafficking to the Rotary E-Club of Silicon Valley and hand the mic over to you.
Great. Thanks for having me. I appreciate just creating the space to talk more about this issue. So I direct the South Bay Coalition and Human Trafficking. We're a collaborative work group that is in the South Bay, which is primarily Silicon Valley, but we also have a regional footprint. I've been working in the field for over 15 years now. I started in Calcutta, India, where I worked with an income generation project. So with survivors who had been exploited or very high risk of, and working on the stage of reintegration, making sure that they have tools for economic sustainability. And so that experience really solidified that I want to do something in this field. So when I went to law school in Santa Clara, that's what I really focused on and kind of started working with our coalition. We have about 35 member agencies. It's a very diverse group, but only a staff of two. So that's me and a coordinator. So really everything we do is based on partnership. That's with law enforcement, with advocates, with attorneys, government agencies, child welfare, with outreach groups, and community members. So just, I just want to set the stage because often when we talk about human trafficking, different, thoughts come to mind, where it happens, who it happens to, but really the definition of trafficking is pretty expansive. And essentially we're talking about exploitation, of a person. And that's either for their labor, their services, it could be sexual exploitation. And the key thing about trafficking is they feel they cannot leave. So there might be different, it might be physical force, but often what we see is that there's things that you cannot see. So there might be financial coercion, there might be psychological coercion, that is very embedded within the situation that keeps that individual in that state of exploitation. With the additional note that when you have a minor and they're being sexually exploited, you don't have to show what is also an elemental piece of trafficking, which is that coercion that I was talking about, the reason why somebody is staying in that situation. Just having a young person who's being sexually exploited is enough to show that they are a trafficking survivor. So it's a pretty expansive definition because we're looking all the way, we're looking at workers' rights, we're looking at labor trafficking, labor exploitation, and then different intersectional industries like potentially massage establishments where you might have both, or you might have, sexual exploitation, which many people usually think of first, which is street level sex work, or what you might see in online advertisements. But what we also know is that, and we've had the experience of having the Super Bowl in 2016, but in 2026, we're actually going to be hit with an onslaught of major sporting events. We have the Super Bowl in February, then we have March Madness in San Jose, and then we're also going to have the World Cup, which is 6 games in Silicon Valley. So you're talking about 6 months of kind of engagement with a lot of tourists coming to the area for the purposes of these various sports. And what has happened alongside that is this narrative about what is the relationship of trafficking and sporting events. And so one of the key things to take away is that large events don't cause trafficking, but economics drives exploitation. So if you have a lot of individuals coming to an area, you will expect there to be a higher demand for labor and services. What's hard is that the research doesn't necessarily, and it gets a little bit nuanced. So I'll tell you about what we do know in terms of the research. So there is research that shows that when we're looking at online advertisements as it relates to selling of sex, we know that there is an increase in online advertisements. So what that actually tells us is that there is a perception of an increased demand, but we can't validate that there's actually an increase in demand for sex at these large events. But we do know that the online advertisements, so people posting the ads, believe that there's an increase. So that perception is there. The other hard part about that is that when you're looking at online advertisements that are selling sex, it's often hard to distinguish what's sex trafficking and what's sex work. So, who's actually selling sex and they have agency, they're not being controlled by somebody or coerced by somebody versus if they're being trafficked. The exception is when you have a minor. And so what we often see then is that efforts often focus on minors because it's easier to identify, especially in that sphere. Um, there's also a lack of research as it relates to labor trafficking, even though when we're talking about these large events, it's pretty clear that we're going to have an increase in demand for labor and services. This may be in the way of actual construction, which I don't think we're going to see as much of that, but we are still seeing in hospitality industry construction happening. But it also, in terms of the service industry, hospitality industry is going to be huge industry where you're seeing their workforce has to expand out. And the risk there is that when we talk about as soon as you start bringing in different levels of supply chain, so if you're subcontracting out for workers, that's a vulnerability because often there's not as many checks to see, are you paying your workers properly? Are there fair wages? How are you treating your workers? So we've had cases in the South Bay, Silvery Towers, which was commonly known as Slavery Towers, which was this huge residential construction site. And you wouldn't think, but because of the subcontracting, the individuals working on that site were actually being kept in a warehouse, locked in at night and being fed rice and beans. They had major medical issues. It was a definite situation of trafficking. So you just won't think about it because it's happening in everyday life. So we know that this is kind of our framework for what to expect at these events. The way that we responded to it, and this comes back to 2014, is we did case studies on previous sporting events, cities, as well as Super Bowl, but also World Cup and the Olympics. And we came up with a regional work group that we pulled these guiding principles out of these case studies. And this is from direct information because there wasn't a lot of data. So we talked to law enforcement, advocates, attorneys, and we wanted to find out how do we prepare then for this event in a mindful way. One is that the data is not comprehensive. And even now, 10 years later, even though there's a little bit more data, we still can't make, any kind of conclusive statements about the relationship. So we have to be careful about how we talk about it. We know that labor trafficking is still often unaddressed, that the media sensationalism can be harmful, and that criminalization also can be very harmful. And what I mean by that is if you look at a lot of stats as it relates to these big events, we often rely on law enforcement stats. But when you start looking at the actual arrest demographics, you find that there are some cities when they provide, we had 50 arrests, they'll tell you that a certain number of those arrests were for adult females. And so it brings up a red flag of are you arresting potential survivors who are just not identifying as survivors, so you're arresting them for prostitution. And that's a really dangerous dichotomy that I'll talk about in a second. But these are our overarching goals because what we want to make sure is that even for one sporting event, that we have goals that really relate to our long-term sustainability, that we're creating consistent messaging so that we have a 9-county region. We want people to know the same information in each county, especially because we know that there are tourists who might be staying in one county but coming to another for the games. We want to maximize resources. Each of our counties kind of has its own ecosystem. They have their own focus areas, their own strengths and weaknesses, and how we can maximize those resources. And then we do it through collective impact. The other added change to all of this is that in Qatar, in 2022, there's more of a focus on labor trafficking. And that's because there were actual deaths associated with the building of the stadium, and there was noted labor trafficking and exploitation. So there was reports that came out about it that really then put labor trafficking and exploitation on an international stage. The response to that is FIFA has now required host cities to have a human rights strategy. So for us, it's a leverage point that we can use, and I'll talk more about how we're really leveraging awareness through these events. But what that also means is that we're looking more broadly beyond trafficking to a lot of the root causes. So what are we expecting for these games? This is what we know for sure. We know that there will be an increase of attention to the issue of trafficking. We've already started getting some phone calls, seeing some news articles about it. So we need to be able to respond to that. We know there's potential for new partnerships. So often with trafficking, we're constantly trying to build capacity. Much of what our coalition does is really building capacity to identify and build capacity to respond and prevent. But with these games, you start to get the ear of industries that don't often come to the table, and that would include hospitality industry. So we have a huge opportunity now to engage with hotels, bars, restaurants, because they're a little bit more willing to engage and do training in anticipation of these events. We also know that it's a pretty unique situation where there are organizations that focus on the issue of trafficking and exploitation, but they do so in the context of large events. So they actually follow around large events around the country. This can be problematic if their messaging contradicts yours. It can also be problematic in the sense that we really try to focus on the broad spectrum of trafficking, meaning we know that often trafficking efforts focus on minors who are being sexually exploited, but we also want to focus on somebody who's over 18. We also want to focus on intersectional situations where it might be a massage establishment. It might be a situation of domestic violence where there's also trafficking. So we want to make sure that our messaging really is at the forefront of all of our work here. And of course, the labor trafficking that I mentioned, we need to keep that in the conversation as well. We also know that I think they're estimating maybe 500,000. I have to check. The tourism groups are estimating a large number of people that will be coming to our region and in different waves. And there'll be different kind of groups because we have Super Bowl is going to primarily be domestic. But when we talk about World Cup, we actually don't know which games and which countries will be hosting until December. But it will definitely change kind of in terms of how we increase access and how we are focusing some of our awareness efforts. And then the last piece that often we don't think about, but there will be law enforcement operations in anticipation of these events. So associated with each of these events will be operations. What's crucial for us is to make sure that we have service providers who are ready to respond to all of those operations. So that really requires a heightened sense of partnership. But again, it requires making sure that the advocates are all coordinating across the region to fill each other's gaps so they can be ready for any kind of 24-hour response. So how do we prepare? I mentioned leveraging the events for awareness. So, one of the questions is if we don't know what the relationship is, shouldn't we just not engage because of the sensationalism? Our approach is no, that we want to be able to provide the messaging, otherwise somebody else will. That's one piece. The other piece is we have a large opportunity for having a lot of people who are coming here for an event. And we don't need to create a negative correlation, but we can create a positive way of engaging with tourists so that we raise their level of awareness to what happens every day, which is human trafficking. And that happens really in any part of the world. So we're trying to leverage these events to raise awareness. We're trying to make sure we're proactively partnering. So with those outside groups, we're engaging with them now. With industries that we don't typically work with, we're engaging them proactively. And alongside that, we're trying to really encourage best practices. What we know is helpful for an overarching approach, which is making sure we're culturally responsive, we're trauma informed, that we're survivor centered. And we do this through multidisciplinary collaboration. And having the large influx of people to our region, I mentioned we don't quite know yet, but we're going to be focusing on increasing access. And that's going to depend upon some of the countries that are coming here in terms of language access. We're also just trying to ensure that we are taking a regional approach. The games are in Santa Clara County, all three of them, but it's pretty clear there will be events all the way in San Francisco, in Oakland, and people will be staying anywhere from Napa all the way down to Monterey. So the other thing I just want to flag is that I mentioned this victim offender dichotomy. So this is kind of the scope of different laws. as it relates to trafficking. You can no longer arrest a minor for prostitution in California, which shouldn't doesn't make any sense because if a minor is being sexually exploited, being paid shouldn't make them an offense, right? I mean, children cannot consent to sex, so they should not be able to be punished for being sold for sex, is the better way of saying it. So that law is now, I think it's about probably 10 years old at this point. Those are called safe harbor laws, but they don't exist in every state. And so that's interesting to think about because that's a mindset that requires shifting then. And it also relates to this victim offender dichotomy. So even though now we're acknowledging that minors can't be sold for sex, it's still a hurdle for us in a culture shift where you see somebody who's over 18 engaging in sex work. If they don't readily identify as a victim, does that mean that we should arrest them? And so these are the kind of interesting parts of our law that we just need to realize that, yes, it relates to law enforcement. It also relates to how we as society respond to this issue as well. Here's some core messaging. I've kind of been bringing this all throughout, but this is kind of what we are really focusing on is core messaging, making sure this is consistent all throughout the region. And we're really using that social leverage model, obviously through billboards. I mentioned engaging with hospitality, but we're really trying to hone in on how we can increase access. And so our big thing is a resource navigator called Safety for the Bay, which will help increase kind of access to any kind of services, not just trafficking, but sexual assault, domestic violence, mental health, substance use. It's a resource navigator for the entire region. So that's kind of our main outputs. So we're really leveraging a lot of this attention, this momentum, and just what we're anticipating next year to see how we can create sustainable solutions and really raise awareness on this issue. And these are our billboard campaigns. I can always circle back to these because they're very purposely don't include any demographics of human beings. They really want us to think about trafficking that's happening in our everyday life. And it's kind of our big push for the region as well. And with that, I will pause and see if there are questions.
There are always questions. Absolutely, Sharon. Thank you very much. We will come back into the slides as needed, but let me take just a minute and introduce the group that we've got on the call. First, I'll introduce our friend of the club in Budapest, Hungary. That's Victoria. Victoria, good to see you. Then three members. We are all in California today, interestingly. From Catalina Island is Ernie. In the Sacramento area is Mike. I am in San Mateo, though I live in San Jose. Sharon, we're going to start with a question from Mike on this. I am fascinated by this question as well because of the current policies on immigration and pursuit of undocumented people. Are traffickers exploiting the fear and pressure that undocumented workers maybe feel to be protected in some way? Like, is that something that you're seeing with your partners in the coalition?
I mean, honestly, even before kind of what we're seeing now, immigration has always been used as a tool by traffickers. So even pre this administration, we've seen that traffickers will always use somebody's status as a tool to coerce them. It's even worse now because the threat is so palpable. So we do know that what we're seeing is there's a decrease of people reaching out for help. Because it's far easier for traffickers to say, if you don't do this, or I'm not going to pay you. And if you complain to anybody, you're just going to be deported. That's a very real fear. So we're absolutely seeing that. I think even now it goes a step further where individuals who are not even considered traffickers are opting to not pay people because they can leverage immigration status. So we're seeing exploitation of that happening, really, really all across the U.S. Yes.
Wow, frightening. Let's talk about the activities of the coalition and its partners. Victoria asked what the biggest success story has been so far. Is there something that you would point to where you say, that was one of the really great examples of what can happen when a set of partners work together well?
Oh, yeah. I mean, when I read your question, I was actually thinking success story in terms of individuals, and it's hard to pick just one story. I will flag that, there are so many survivor leaders who are just doing incredible things, and each one of those is just an incredible success story, but also testament to how forgiving and how resilient human beings are. So I think those are always just incredible stories to hear about. But in terms of the collaboration, one of our successes, so with the last Super Bowl, we planned for 2 years, 2014 to 2016. And we were able to have 69 agency or 67 agencies from 9 counties all agree to one-page messaging. So for us, that's a huge success because you're talking about national organizations, law enforcement, state and federal. You're talking about service providers. You're talking about civic government, nonprofits. All of these groups agreed on one-page messaging in terms of how we are spreading awareness. And I think that is a really big success story because each agency kind of has their own focus area. We can't always align on everything, but the fact that we were able to align on like core messaging and some of these really simple outputs that can have a huge impact, I'd say that was one of our biggest success stories. Alongside that, we had service providers around the region who were able to respond to all law enforcement operations. And I think that's really crucial too, because you want to be able to have services available immediately when a survivor is identified, so they feel they can start to regain stability immediately.
When you introduced the Venn diagram on your
Oh,
slide
yes.
early in the presentation, we've spent quite a bit of time talking about sex slavery, the labor abuses that happen. Can you talk a little bit about the domestic servitude side of these things? I'm curious, even if it is the case that there are those who may be engaged in this and don't actually they're not actually conscious of what it is that they're doing that makes this a trafficking issue.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Domestic servitude is interesting in that it's hard to identify because it usually happens within homes. But I will note that one of the earliest cases identified in the Bay Area in Walnut Creek was a domestic servitude case. It was and often again, cultural responsiveness is really important because people know how to exploit people from their own community without physical force. Like they know the cultural nuances, they know how to create cultural obligation. So in this case, an individual had been trafficked or had been brought over from the host country, and I have to remember it was in South America, the host country, and so the family who was here, they brought them in to work as a nanny. But what happened is that they were working 7 days a week. There were no breaks. It was just constant a situation of constant exploitation, and the person couldn't leave in part because of that immigration status, but also just the isolation. You can imagine they're not aware of how to get help here. They may be fearful of reaching out for help. What ended up happening in that particular case is this individual was always dropping off the children to school, and one of the other parents noticed that this individual always had tattered clothes. It didn't match the child, right? So they always had torn clothes. They did not look like they were kept well. They were malnourished. And it was a red flag of, how are they treating this person who's taking care of their child? And so that was how that case got identified. Um, I feel like your question was a little bit like, how does the person, it relates to how people self-identify as victims. It sounded like that was a little part of your question.
Actually, I was thinking about the kinds of practices related to domestic help. And so, is it the case that there are people who they're hiring people, kind of on the side or something like that, and that
I see.
that that ends up being part and parcel to activities that are just not legal.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a spectrum when you look at wage theft and labor exploitation, and on one end is labor trafficking. And again, um, labor trafficking is essentially when you have wage theft, and a person cannot leave. So, a lot of domestic servitude can include different it can be somewhere on that spectrum that doesn't rise to the level of trafficking. The situation I explained, it was definitely a situation of trafficking because they could not leave. In some situations, you may have somebody who, they're not paying them properly according to what our laws are, and that's a form of exploitation, but it doesn't rise to the level of trafficking if that person can leave.
That makes sense. And
Yeah.
and by the way, I mean, just the opportunity to really look at the varying definitions and activities that are part of this is a really powerful piece of the presentation. I'm going to wind things down and then hand it back to you for the final word. But I'll just let everybody know that one of the things you may well want to do next is to go to South Bay End Trafficking, CKING.org, to learn more about the work that Sharan and her small team is doing to connect with organizations and make a difference in the lives of those who are suffering from the scourge that is trafficking. We do thank all of you who have taken your time to watch this recording or to listen to the podcast. We know that these stories are stories that are they're stories that are important for improving our communities and sharing them with others, learning that there are things that you can do that can make an impact in a space where it might be tremendously needed by a group or even an individual. We ask that you let people know about Rotary.cool, which is the easy way to get to our site. Rotary.org if you are interested in learning about Rotary International. And we hope that you will even consider the possibility of joining a service group, whether it is ours, another Rotary Club, or one of several fine organizations that operate around the world. As we always like to do, we hand it back to our speaker for the final word. Sharan, what would you like people to have clearly in mind as they finish watching or listening to this recording?
Well, we've been talking about, the sporting events and trafficking, but trafficking really happens every day. And it intersects in our life in different ways. And it's not always this really obvious situation with some of the, images we've seen over the years. So I just want people to know that there's ways to impact this issue on a daily basis, and that everybody has a role to play. And I hope that, next year, as the messages come out, that you think more just more thoughtfully about this issue and how we can impact it even in small ways.
Thank you, Sharan. Thank you, everyone. We will see you next week.